I'm Dr. William Worrell. On behalf of the university and the Department of Psychology, I'd like to welcome you here on this very special occasion. Our guest speaker today, Noam Chomsky, is the best known and most widely recognized scholar intellectual in the world today. Not only has he made monumental contributions to the field of linguistics, but he has contributed much to the thinking and research of many other disciplines. For example, his work in psycholinguistics has become the foundation of psycholinguistics, a branch of psychology. Additionally, he opposed the strict environmental position of American behaviorism, specifically the views of J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. Professor Chomsky also ushered in the doctrine of nativism and made it respectable and viable in the interpretation and of an understanding human behavior, particularly how children learn to talk. At this point, I want to introduce to you the person who is primarily responsible for our guest's appearance today. Mr. Eric Epstein, an undergraduate psychology major, asked our guest to speak here, and if it weren't for him, we probably wouldn't be assembled together here today. So I think that it is proper and fitting that Mr. Epstein make the formal introduction of our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Worrell. When the plans were finalized for Professor Chomsky's lecture, and we started to let people know about his talk, I heard some interesting reactions. How did you get, according to the New York Times, arguably the most important intellectual alive, America's leading social critic, author of over 70 books, to agree to speak at Kutztown University? My response was very simple. We just called him up and asked him. In fact, Professor Chomsky will talk to anyone who's willing to listen. Noam Chomsky has spoken to more college students than any other speaker in the world, presenting his thesis and motivating us to critically think. I also heard other reactions, such as, who is Noam Chomsky? I'm a political science and journalism major, a senior. I'm sure I would have heard of him if he was all of that. Although Professor Chomsky is quite well known in many circles, his dissenting views and numerous books are seldom discussed in political science or journalism courses, because I believe they reveal too much about our society and how it really functions. Professor Chomsky's undergraduate and graduate years were spent at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his PhD in linguistics in 1955. During the years 1951 to 1955, he was a junior fellow of the Harvard University Society of Fellows. He is an institute professor at MIT, where he's been since 1955. Over the last 40 years, he has revolutionized the field of linguistics. From 1966 to 1976, Professor Chomsky held the Ferrari P. Ward Professorship of Modern Languages and Linguistics. During the years 1958 to 1959, Professor Chomsky was in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey. In the spring of 1969, he delivered the John Locke Lectures at Oxford. In January 1970, he delivered the Bertrand Russell Memorial Lecture at Cambridge University. In 1972, the Nehru Memorial Lecture in New Delhi. And in 1977, the Huizinga Lecture in Leiden. Professor Chomsky has received honorary degrees from the University of London, the University of Massachusetts, and the University of Pennsylvania, to mention a few. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award of the American Psychological Association and the Kyoto Prize from Japan. In addition to his widely recognized academic contributions, Professor Chomsky is America's leading dissident intellectual, and again, according to the Times, perhaps the clearest voice of dissent in American history. Professor Chomsky challenges us to recognize the sickening hypocrisies in our establishment's claims, supposedly in the support of freedom and democracy at home and abroad, as well as to recognize the flood of lies and distortions present in every area of mainstream political discourse. He inspires us to question authority and conventional wisdom in all aspects of life, personal, political, and academic, as well as to think about our responsibility to act on our decent human instincts. Professor Chomsky will speak on some comments on the academic and political world, totalitarian values in a free society. Noam Chomsky.
Before I speak about anything, are you getting the same echo that I'm getting up here? No? Okay. I was afraid that somehow these two mics were interacting in an unpleasant fashion. So I'll just suffer with it as long as you don't have to. The topic that was suggested to me, totalitarian values in a free society, sounds like a contradiction at first, but it actually isn't. In fact, it's a rather traditional theme, though it's not usually put in those words. The issue arises from a basic problem in the theory of government, if you like, that was discussed, among others, by David Hume a couple hundred years ago in his fundamental work in political philosophy. Hume was puzzled by the fact that people submit to authority, and he wondered why that is true. And he posed a kind of paradox of government. The paradox is that power lies in the hands of the governed, people who are being governed. So why don't they use it? Why do they listen to their rulers? And his conclusion was that the way that that happens is through control over opinion. If you can't control the opinion of those who are ruled, they would simply rise up and take power for themselves. And he concluded that this is true of all societies, from the most despotic to the most free. And I think there's a lot of truth to that doctrine, although it does require two comments, I think. One is that Hume very much underestimated the degree of violence that is in the hands of powerful states and that can control people even if they, no matter what their opinions are. That was true in his day, and it's even more dramatically true in our day. So if you were a dissident in, say, pre-Gorbachev Russia, life could be pretty unpleasant. In the days of Stalin, terribly unpleasant. In the post-war period, it could mean exile or punishment of one sort or another, and varying degrees of unpleasantness. If you're a dissident in a typical U.S. dependency, like, say, El Salvador or Guatemala, you're likely to end up by a roadside, cut into shreds with machete after being tortured. If you're a dissident in other U.S. dependencies today, like, say, Haiti, you're again likely to be tortured or, say, murdered, as one of President Aristide's leading backers was the other day. And if you're still alive, you can listen to, you can read this morning's New York Times and discover that the United States isn't going to do anything about it. They'll send down observers, but they'll only observe the torture and the terror. They won't be authorized to interfere with it. Well, there are various ways, in short, of controlling dissidents by extreme violence, and we should know all about them since we run some of the worst of them. That's one problem in Hume's account. It's not the case that in the most despotic societies, control of opinion is really necessary. There are other means. But he's right about the societies that are more free. When the government loses the capacity, when state power or other domestic power loses the capacity to control people by violence, it naturally turns to control of opinion and seeks to install totalitarian values in one or another form. In fact, I think a proper emendation of Hume's paradigm doctrine would be that control of thought is much more significant and much more important as societies become more free, for the obvious reason that if you can't control people by the bludgeon, but you're committed to controlling them, that is, it is an inegalitarian society with power highly concentrated, as is every existing society, past and present, then you must turn to other means of control, and control of opinion is about the only one left, as Hume recognized. Furthermore, that conclusion has been pretty widely understood in the West. In fact, it's a leading doctrine of modern political science and modern political leadership, and certainly of the corporate community, often articulated quite explicitly throughout this century, and in fact we can trace it back hundreds of years. In the modern period, say take World War II, what I've proposed as in World War I, the emendation that I proposed to Hume's doctrine, namely that you need control of opinion much more in the more free societies, that was pretty clear in World War I. The more free societies were the Anglo-American ones. The more autocratic society was German. And in fact, Britain and the United States had by far the greatest achievements in propaganda and thought control during World War I, a fact which was noticed and has been quite influential for the period that followed. Woodrow Wilson had a problem when he was elected president in 1916. The problem was that he was elected on the program of peace without victory, but he was committed to victory without peace. So something had to be done about that. And in fact, the country had to be somehow turned from a pacifist country into a country of raving jingoist warmongers. Well, that took about 6 months. Under a huge propaganda campaign of a kind which was quite unprecedented, with the leadership of progressive intellectuals, I should say, people in John Dewey's circle, who later took great pride in this achievement. They described this as the first time that a country had been driven to war, not by generals and kings and so on, but by the more intelligent members of the community, namely ourselves. Anybody who speaks is one of the more intelligent members of the community. And the more intelligent members of the community had succeeded in bringing the population to understand why we must go to war, using materials provided for them by British intelligence, which had committed itself, as they put it, to controlling the thought of the world, and was quite happy to provide fabricated horror stories about Belgian children with their arms torn off and all sorts of other stuff, which in fact you often still read about in history books, but which was mostly fabricated by British intelligence, and a whole pile of other stuff. And the Wilson administration, liberal Wilson administration, progressives, in order to facilitate this, set up the first government propaganda agency, Creel Commission, which was specifically committed to controlling thought. Its major task was to build up support for an extremely unpopular war, and its later tasks were to, I'll come to them. And it was very successful. One of the founders of modern American political science, Harold Lasswell, who is in particular the founder of the field that's called communications and so on, which basically means propaganda, he began his career with a study of propaganda during the First World War. He described Woodrow Wilson as the generalissimo of propaganda, and he was much impressed by the achievements of the Creel Commission in bringing the population into hysterical support for a war that they opposed, and all sorts of jingoist fanaticism and hatred of all things German and this and that and the other thing, simply by propaganda, most of it fabricated, a lot of it provided by British intelligence services. Well, as I say, a lot of people noticed this. One of the people who noticed it was Harold Lasswell, and it fed into a major part of contemporary political science. Those undergraduates in political science who you were talking about certainly have heard of Harold Lasswell, but I doubt very much that they have read his work on propaganda, which is quite interesting. Another person who noticed this and was influenced by it was Adolf Hitler. If you read Mein Kampf, you'll find that a large part of it is devoted to his recognition of the great achievements of Anglo-American propaganda and the inability of much more authoritarian Germany to counter it. I mean, the Germans tried to answer the arguments, but they were just wiped out in the competition. British and American propaganda systems were far superior and more effective, and they essentially massacred them. And Hitler noticed that and determined that next time around, the German side would have an efficient propaganda system, which in fact he went on to develop under Nazism. Although, if we were to really do a comparative analysis, it's not at all clear that he ever came close to the achievements of British and American propaganda, even at that period. That's something that could be looked at. I should say this went right on into the Second World War. So, for example, when Franklin Roosevelt, this is quite independent of whether you think it's right to get into the war or wrong to get into it. I'm just describing what happened. A couple of months before Pearl Harbor, when President Roosevelt was trying to build up support for the war in the United States. It was a very pacifist country at that time. We didn't see any point in getting involved in European conflict. One of his major speeches showed a big map of the Western Hemisphere, which he said was a German map, and it described the plans of Germany to conquer the entire Western Hemisphere. And the map was in fact real. It had been provided by British intelligence, who had fabricated it again, and who were very eager to get the U.S. into war. And such efforts went on, and they were very intensive. Anybody my age can remember them from the Second World War. They were quite something to see. Political scientists and Adolf Hitler recognized the achievements of the propaganda of the Generalissimo of propaganda, Woodrow Wilson, but probably more significant for the long term was that the American business community was very much impressed by this. One of the members of the Creel Commission, the Woodrow Wilson Propaganda Commission, was Edward Bernays, who just had his 101st birthday a day or two ago, who is sort of the grand old man of the American public relations industry, sort of one of the great founders of the PR industry. He was in the Creel Commission, and he recognized that you really can do a lot to control people's minds through propaganda, and he thought this ought to be put to use, and there are people around who pay for that sort of thing, so you put it to use for the people who are going to pay for it, which means the business community. Now that didn't initiate the use of the PR industry. The public relations industry is a huge industry. It's an American invention. Nobody knows quite how big it is because private corporations are immune to public inspection. You know, governments sometimes leak documents, but corporations don't. So that's real totalitarian private power. You can't get into it. But occasionally some material comes out in, you know, Senate inquiries or something. The last one I saw was about late 70s, when it was estimated that the PR industry spends about $1 billion a year in grassroots propaganda, and unknown further amounts in what is sometimes called treetop propaganda, that is trying to get after smart guys, you know, universities and academic institutions and educated people, folks like us, in other words. And there's unknown amounts spent in that, and maybe $1 billion for grassroots propaganda at that time, undoubtedly far higher since. The PR industry took off in the early part of this century. That was a period when American capitalism was undergoing a change. from a more or less, some degree of proprietary competitive capitalism to highly administered, centralized capitalism under big corporate control. It was the period when people were worried about trusts and things like that. We always had a very interventionist state. Nobody ever believed that capitalism could function, but it used to be more competitive and more proprietary in the 19th century, and there's a big change taking place. And there was a lot of concern about it. People didn't like the trusts, for one thing because they were so corrupt, and for another thing because they were so violent. It was a period of, they had power over they had state power at their hands. People who lived around here back in that period know that very well. Violent strike-breaking and terror in Pennsylvania was notorious, in fact, for the use of state terror to violently suppress labor organization and that sort of thing, Homestead being the major example. So there was a lot of concern in the country about this shift, and there's a lot of hatred of the new magnates, John Rockefeller and those guys. And the PR industry was in fact developed as an attempt to deal with this, to bring people to accept these folks as sort of nice, friendly people who were trying to help us all out. It took off at that period, and it was pretty successful. In fact, had remarkable success. With the First World War and this new insight into the importance and the ability to control people's thought by propaganda, it really took off. And immediately, the latter stage of the Second World War and afterwards, there was an extraordinarily successful state business, kind of state corporate propaganda campaign, went well beyond propaganda, pretty violent too, in order to try to destroy the incipient labor movement, to smash up strikes, to destroy and to demolish independent thought, to stop independent politics, to place the country under really total business control. Wilson's Red Scare was a large part of this, thousands of people exiled and so on, and it was very successful. In the 1920s, the country was very passive. It was strictly under business control, and in fact the business community thought that this achievement had, everyone thought pretty much that this achievement had succeeded in beating back the threat of democracy in the United States, probably permanently, the threat of democracy and labor organizing. Well, that belief collapsed, and it's at that point that the PR industry really took off with program. With quite frankly, incidentally, you look at the books written at that time; they're all about propaganda and the need for propaganda in a free society, and how you have to control people, and so on and so forth. The phrases that were used were things like, you have to control the public mind because the public mind is the greatest threat to corporations. Pretty much Hume's doctrine, but now applied to private power, not just to government power. In the 1930s, with the Big Depression, the passivity of the population was broken. There was a new democratic thrust. American workers began to organize. They finally got the rights that had been achieved in Europe decades earlier. And this rising threat of democracy and social justice really sent fear into the business community. Again, the National Association of Manufacturers at that time was writing about what they called the hazard facing industrialists in the rising political power of the masses. You'll notice the kind of vulgar Marxist tinge to that, but that's common in the business literature and also in government documents. It reads like vulgar Marxist texts usually. It's just that all the values are inverted. The terminology is the same. It's a highly class-conscious group. So they were very much worried about the rising political power of the masses, which is the greatest hazard facing industrialists. And I'm just quoting from NAM literature. They said their thinking, the thinking of the masses, must be directed to more proper channels, or we are definitely headed for adversity. Well, again, a big campaign started in the latter part of the 1930s, the latter part of the Roosevelt administration. In part, it used the traditional methods, a resort to state violence to murder strikers and so on. That was going on right around here, incidentally, in the little steel strikes in the late 30s. But more and more they began to rely on thought control as a more efficacious device of controlling people than violence. And also one more available in a society that was really becoming more free, when the government didn't have it was losing the power to control people by the bludgeon. So you began to, that's at the time when, right in Pennsylvania, in fact, you found they experimented with what were called scientific methods of strike breaking, meaning ways, formulas for moving into a community with massive public relations campaigns to try to convince the population that there's a split between us and them. You know, us, we guys, are the sober working man, the housewife taking care of her children, you know, the storekeeper taking care of his store, the executive in the local corporation laboring day and night for the benefit of the entire population, and so on. That's us. And them are foreigners who are trying to come in and break up our harmony and attack Americanism and destroy our values and disrupt our lives and so on, like the ones who were trying to organize the CIO, let's say. These campaigns had an enormous amount of, this also it involved lots of other things, but that was the basic story. Try to set up a picture of harmony and Americanism on the one side, which is classless, of course, and disruption and, you know, anarchism and Bolshevism, and you pick it on the other side, which was going to disrupt all of this nice stuff. That presents a particular vision of what America is. America is a class dictatorship run by the business community the way it was in the 1920s, with everybody else passive and marginalized. That's Americanism, and the people who disrupt that are anti-American and against our lives and against our communities, and we've got to stop them. Well, that was the main theme, and it turned out to be pretty successful. In fact, business was quite impressed by these scientific methods of strike breaking, as they were called. The project was put on hold during the Second World War. You know, there was another thing to worry about. But it was picked up very quickly right afterwards. And immediately after the Second World War, a huge campaign developed to try to beat back the threat of democracy and social movements and so on that had developed, in fact, during the 1930s. And it was extremely successful. That's one of the reasons why the United States is off the international spectrum on most issues, like, say, workers' rights or health. Or everybody's talking about health now. And as everyone knows, this is the only industrial country that doesn't have some form of national health care. Everybody else has it and has had it forever. It's much more efficient, it's much cheaper, it reaches a lot more people, doesn't have all the problems of the highly bureaucratized and inefficient privately based systems. But we can't have it. And in fact, it was proposed. It was proposed by Harry Truman, in fact, back in the mid-40s, and beaten back by a huge lobbying campaign of business, precisely on the basis that I described: anti-American, opposed to harmony, attacking our fundamental rights, pointy-headed bureaucrats, Bolsheviks, I mean, usual business. And it was successful. Remember, there's no counterpart to corporate propaganda. They own the place. So when there's a propaganda campaign, it's like 99% on one side, maybe 1% on the other. And in fact, Truman later objected. If you look at his own writings and biography, he described this as the biggest business campaign in history, which had simply eliminated the possibility of elementary social justice, the kind that you have in just about every other country, let alone efficiencies, much more efficient, these other systems, in the United States. That was a major achievement. We're going through another phase of it right now, so it's worth looking at. Another example was the Office of Price Administration. There were huge wartime profits, but prices were kept down, wages were kept down. And the Office of Price Administration had some effect on lowering prices so that people could buy things. Business was naturally strongly opposed to that. The public was strongly in favor of continuing it. So if you look at polls around 1945, it's like, you know, 80% in favor of continuing it. Business again launched a huge public relations campaign which within about 6 months had turned the figures around. And about 80%, you know, I forget the figures, like 75% opposition and so on, and Congress smashed it. Well, these again are great achievements of propaganda. They were noticed. I mean, it was the next thing that came along was the Taft-Hartley bill, which essentially terminated the possibility of labor organizing, and it was followed by various other things. One of the reasons why the United States has now one of the weakest labor movements in the world, in the industrial world, you know, like not as bad as some fascist country, but in the sort of advanced industrial world, the United States is again off the spectrum on labor rights. In fact, astonishingly, the United States was condemned last year by the International Labor Organization, which never condemns any of its rich sponsors, because the United States was the only industrial country that wasn't permitting the right to strike, meaning it was allowing what are called permanent replacement workers, meaning you go on strike, we hire scabs, and you're out. And that's a gross violation of international labor standards, but has been building up in the United States and finally succeeded. Reagan pushed it through with the flight, what do you call them? The guys who on the control towers, I forget the name for them, and it really rammed through with the Caterpillar strike in 1992, which was a major event, which caused, in fact, the condemnation. So the United States is well off the international spectrum on that one again. And remember, this is the most free society in the world. I mean, it is, in fact. There's no other country, at least none that I know of, where the government is so constrained in its capacity to interfere and control, you know, to sort of stop free speech or, you know, break into newspapers or whatever. Very, comparatively speaking, very free country. Consequently, I think, much more committed to totalitarian values because they're necessary. You have to control people somehow, and it's better not to have things like labor movements and organized populations and so on and so forth, because they might do something with their freedom. You can't really control them by force. There's all sorts of methods of doing this kind of thing. Let's go back to some of the thinking behind it. Going back to, say, Harold Lasswell, who's one of the original pioneers of this, back in the 20s and 30s, people used to be pretty frank. I mean, it was a kind of like less Orwellian society than today. So when they were involved in propaganda, they called it propaganda. So if you look at, say, the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences in 1933, there in fact is an essay on propaganda written by Harold Lasswell. And he describes how important it is, particularly in free societies. Like other serious analysts, he recognized that propaganda becomes more important as you move away from more authoritarian societies, what nowadays we would call totalitarian societies, and use the term then. So as you move away from these, you got to have a greater reliance on propaganda, you know, which he said is propaganda. He said is as neutral as a pump handle. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. He didn't raise the question of who's going to be pushing the pump. That's somebody else's domain. But propaganda is neutral, you know, good or bad. And if you look at the distribution of power in the society, you can answer the unasked question. He also said propaganda is necessary because he said because of the ignorance and stupidity of the masses. He said we should not succumb to what he called democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. We smart guys are the best judges of their own interests, and therefore we got to make sure that these ignorant and stupid masses don't enter the public arena, or they'll suffer too. I mean, they're much better off if we run the affairs for them. But unfortunately, you know, we can't send them to the gulag and put them in gas chambers and that sort of thing. So therefore, we have to control their thinking. That's he didn't say that, I'm adding that. But that's the kind of logic that lies behind it, to put it in sort of crass, though not inaccurate terms. These views that he was developing then had in fact been articulated much more clearly and in a way more influentially about a decade earlier by Walter Lippmann, who was sort of major commentator on public affairs, sort of the dean of American journalism, and a leading progressive intellectual, came out of the sort of Wilson Dewey school, and who had a background in the propaganda agencies of the First World War as well. During the 1920s, he wrote extensively on these topics in what are called, if you pick up his essays in the bookstore, you'll notice they're called progressive essays on democracy. And they did represent the progressive view. The progressive view of democracy, as Wilson developed it, and as is constantly assumed, is that there are two categories of people. There are what he called the responsible men. That's us smart guys again. There's the responsible men, who are a small group, and then there are those who he called the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. That's the population. So there's a problem here. We got to make sure, it's Hume's problem. How do we make sure that the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders don't meddle in what is none of their business, namely public affairs, and leave it to the responsible men? He said the main problem is, he said, to protect ourselves from the trampling and the rage of the bewildered herd. That's this huge mass of people out there. And this is all out of pure benevolence. I mean, it's just because we want to help them, you know. We want to help them, and if this bewildered herd and starts meddling in stuff that's none of their business, there'll be all kind of problems. So we have to do something, and it's obvious what we have to do. We don't control them by force, we control them by propaganda, and we try to reach a state which he described. He said, look, it's not what we would nowadays call a totalitarian society, it's a free society. And in a free democratic society, he said, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders do have a function, because it's democratic. Their function is to be spectators of action, not participants. And they're allowed to look, in other words, so you don't have to keep them in total ignorance. Furthermore, they're allowed to participate in a very special fashion. Periodically, they are to be given an opportunity to lend their weight to one or another representative of the responsible men. That's called an election. And after that, they're supposed to go home and be spectators again. That's the role of the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders in a free society. And as I say, I'm now giving the progressive view. There's a spectrum of views on this. This is the sort of liberal progressive side. It goes over to the reactionary side. When you get to the more reactionary side, like say the Reagan administration, their view is that the population shouldn't even be spectators. So even the spectator role is to be excluded, and you can see it very clearly in their policies. I mean, they call themselves conservatives, but that's a joke. They were radical statists, believers in an extremely powerful state, which furthermore which grew enormously under the Reaganite years, I should say, and has to be a welfare state for the rich. That's the point. So it's a big welfare state, but you know, for other people, you look at the change in income distribution and so on, you can see it. In fact, if you look at polls, you can see it. There's a reason why Reagan is the most disliked living ex-president today, ranking right alongside Richard Nixon, a couple of percentage points apart, and particularly among working people and so-called Reagan Democrats, and one of the most despised people in public life. There's a reason for that. And the reason is exactly this system. Not that he had anything to do with it, you know, he was just like reading his lines, but the people behind him, or sort of put him up there to read the lines, they had a lot to do with it. And they believed in a very powerful interventionist state in which the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders aren't even supposed to be spectators. So the Reagan administration introduced very high levels of censorship and secrecy, unprecedented, in fact, to prevent the public from knowing what was going on. One of the reasons why clandestine operations shot up to such a peak, historically unprecedented peak in the Reagan administration, was that the purpose of clandestine, you know, when a government resorts to clandestine operations, that's a weapon against its own population. I mean, everybody else knows about them. You know, like if you run a clandestine terror war in Central America, the guys who are getting tortured and killed know all about it, and the dozens of other countries that are participating in it, you know, providing advisors for the state terrorists and funding it and so on, they know all about it. In fact, the only people who aren't supposed to know anything about it are the domestic population. That's what's called a clandestine operation. And the purpose of them is to keep the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders away from even the spectator role. The Reagan administration also instituted a state propaganda agency, illegal, as they later conceded when it was exposed, which was running something called Operation Truth. Operation Truth was about what you'd expect after you read 1984. The idea was to try to propagandize the population into accepting, you know, the various things they were up to, like demonizing the Sandinistas and whatever else they were up to. When it was finally exposed, actually, one of the Reagan officials described it as, honestly, as the kind of operation you would carry out in enemy territory, he said. Meaning we were carrying this operation out among the enemy, namely the population of the United States, and they had to be kept from even seeing what was going on. So that's the reactionary end of the spectrum. And there is a choice, you know, democracy, democratic theory sort of falls between those limits. The post, going back to the Second World War, the post-Second World War propaganda campaign had very much the effects of the post-First World War propaganda campaign. It created a period of passivity and apathy. That's what's called the apathetic 50s, and it was real, very real, and with a lot of repression and elimination of independent thought and so on and so forth. That broke down too, in this case not from a depression, but from the ferment of the 1960s, which sort of somehow broke through all this. I mean, interesting how it happened, but anyway, it did happen. And that again caused a tremendous fear and anger on the part of elites. In fact, there was a name for what happened. It was called a crisis of democracy. And in fact, there's a major study, which everyone should read, I always recommend it, called The Crisis of Democracy. The library probably has it. Published in 1975. It was the first major publication of the Trilateral Commission. Trilateral Commission is it's trilateral because it's based in Europe, Japan, and the United States. It's sort of elites, and in fact liberal elites, liberal internationalistly oriented elites from the three major power centers. And their first major publication in 1975, in fact really their only major publication, in fact not the only interesting thing they've done, was this is the group out of which Carter came, and in fact his entire cabinet came from there. That sort of identifies them in the political spectrum. Their first and only major publication was The Crisis of Democracy, and they were referring to the problems that arose in all the three trilateral areas in the 1960s. And what happened was, well, this threat of democracy was arising again. People, normally marginalized and apathetic people, were entering into the public arena. They were becoming organized, they were beginning to think, they were asking questions, they were pressing their demands in public. You know, they were trying to take part in the public process, to be something other than spectators. Naive people could say that's democracy, but you know, if you're sophisticated, if you're one of the responsible, maybe had a good education like you get here, I guess, you know that that's a crisis of democracy that has to be beaten back, and that's the way they described it. The American spokesperson at this, a professor at Harvard, he's now professor of the science of government at Harvard. I love that title. So the professor of the science of government at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, who was the American rapporteur at this thing, he looked back kind of nostalgically to the days of the Truman administration, when he said Truman was able to run the country with the help of a small group of Wall Street lawyers and financiers. And that was democracy. We had a crisis then. But now we've got this business of the 1960s with minorities and women and, you know, young people and all sorts of normally marginalized and passive groups somehow trying to enter this system, and that makes the society ungovernable, he said. It's a problem of ungovernability, and the answer is obvious. You have to beat them back to passivity and obedience, and since this is a free society, you can't do it by force, so you have to go back to methods of propaganda. And in fact, there's been a huge ideological campaign ever since then, trying to beat back the heresy. Since you're living through it, I presume I don't have to talk about it a lot. In this case, I don't think it's been beaten back. It's interesting that it's been much less successful than it was in the 20s and the 50s, but it's in effect a very live issue right now. So just to summarize what I'm saying so far, there is absolutely nothing surprising about the fact, and indeed it is a fact, that there are huge efforts to install totalitarian values in intellectual culture in a society that is more free. In fact, It's exactly what you ought to expect, and it's exactly what we find. In a country where, say, Stalinist Russia, you didn't really care that much about what people thought, because there were a lot of other ways to control them. And in fact, they, turns out, had a lot more access to information and alternative views and so on. It wasn't a big problem because nothing they could do about it anyway, or so they thought. So there were some studies done here by government-funded Russian research centers and so on in the late 1970s, trying to give some estimate of, where Russians, this isn't the worst period of Russian repression, this is Brezhnev days, trying to find, but still totalitarian, trying to see, what people read and what they listened to and where they were getting information from and so on. And, you couldn't go in there and carry out polls, so the numbers you have to take with some, not meant to be precise, they're estimates. But the estimates are quite intriguing. It turned out that about 3/4 of the population was listening to foreign broadcasts, meaning getting Western news regularly. And about 95% of the more educated sectors, white collar, that sort of thing, were listening to foreign broadcasts. With regard to samizdat, technically illegal underground dissident literature, kind of pamphlet you hand out at a street corner, about close to 50% of the sort of white collar, semi-educated people were reading them, and about 15% of blue-collar workers were reading them. Well, in the United States, the equivalent of samizdat, some dissident journal, if it could reach 0.001% of the population, everybody would be having parties at the nearest local bar or something. But in a country that's dissident, of course, nobody listens to foreign broadcasts. If you did a study here of who listens to foreign broadcasts, it would be statistically undetectable. Well, that's important. It's much more important in a free society to constrain the forms of information that reach people. If we were to look at the educational system, we would find similar things. And it must, of course, have an appearance of, it's got to be credible. So it's extremely important to have inside the media, for example, people who are considered to be critics, critics, courageous critics of the system. Liberal doves and that sort of thing. But they play a and their role is to give the system credibility, but nevertheless not to undermine it. So there's a very narrow definition of that role. It's somebody who accepts all the doctrines, but gives a slightly soft slant to them. So, for example, there's a ton of documentation on this if you're interested. There's thousands of pages of details. But just to take one example of how it works, which is well studied, if you take, say, the 1980s, the biggest foreign policy issue was how to destroy Nicaragua. I mean, that was the major propaganda issue. We got to run this terrorist war against Nicaragua, which drives it down to what it now is, namely about the level of Haiti, with tens of thousands of people starving, kids starving in the streets, being kept alive by women with soup kitchens, and political system destroyed and everything else. That was the goal. Bring it back to what was called the Central American mode by the liberal press, by the Washington Post and so on. So, and there was a debate about this. I mean, you all remember this huge issue in the 1980s. In fact, it was the major foreign policy issue. Now, if you look at an interesting indication of the range of opinion and the role of liberal doves and critics is given by a study of the opinion that was permitted in the liberal press. We have two major national journals in the United States, the New York Times and the Washington Post, both of which are considered liberal. So the New York Times, for example, is described in the foreign policy literature as the establishment left. That's what it's called, in fact. So we just look at the establishment left, and the Washington Post, which is considered even more liberal, which happened to be the most important because they're two big national papers. They set the framework within which most other papers and even television follows. They kind of give an agenda. If we look at the opinion pieces, op-eds, editorials, and so on, in that over that period, what do we find? Well, actually, I did a study of that for picking two periods when there was absolute peak intensity, hundreds of op-eds coming out in a few months, which is extremely unusual. And they were very revealing. There was, first of all, close to 100% agreement that the government of Nicaragua had to be overthrown. The only reason it wasn't 100% was that once in a while they'd allow a small statement by the ambassador of Nicaragua. And once in the entire period I looked at, they allowed an op-ed by somebody who actually knew something about the region. A doctor, was the only person who ever knew anything about it. He was a medical a person who was involved in medicine in the Caribbean region, who simply described the differences between the health programs that were going on in Nicaragua, which he'd taken part in and observed, and those that were going on in other programs, and it was very pro-Sandinista article. So that was the one exception apart from the Nicaraguan. So it wasn't 100%. It was like, you know, like 99% agreement that you got to overthrow the government, and there was a division on how you do it. And that division was roughly 50-50. About half the writers said you do it by violence. You run a terrorist war, you know, you kill people, torture them, and so on and so forth. They didn't use those words, but that's what it comes down to. You run the Contra war, and that'll get rid of the, the cancer, as George Shultz called it. That'll excise the cancer. The other 50% approximately said we should do it by more cost-effective means. Like, after all, it's a very weak, tiny country, and we're this huge, powerful monster, so we can just strangle them by economic strangulation and by diplomatic isolation and so on. That'll work, and it's much more cost-effective. You know, it doesn't look so ugly as tortured children and that sort of thing, and it's going to work anyway. Those were called the doves. Now, it's not that now it's kind of interesting to compare this with the attitude of the business community, which is the dominant force in the United States. If you really believe, you know, that the business community just controls the media, you'd predict that among corporate executives, say, there'd also be a 50-50 split on how to get rid of the cancer. But it turns out that's not quite true. It was about an 80-20 split, meaning about 80% of corporate executives were what are called doves. They thought you ought to strangle them by illegal, of course, economic warfare and political isolation and so on. And only about 20% thought you ought to do it by terror. So in fact, the media were not precisely reflecting the attitudes of the business community. They were far more hawkish. That is, they went over more to the government side, which said, in this state-corporate nexus of power, there are some divisions. And the media tended to be more on the state side than just on the corporate side. That's the basic conclusion that comes out. The media, you know, are always criticized for being too liberal and this and that. This is what you find over and over again, and the crucial role of the liberals has to be understood. If you look at the extreme doves, you know, people like, say, Tom Wicker of the New York Times, he was very much opposed to the Contra war. He said it's not going to work, it's going to cost too much, and so on. He said we have to find other methods to restore the Sandinistas to regional standards. Now you have to understand what regional standards are. Regional standards, for example, are the standards of, say, El Salvador and Guatemala, which were at that point terrorist states that we were supplying and training. We're killing maybe 200,000 people in those years. And not just killing, I mean mutilating, torturing, you know, and so on. That's the regional standards, and from the dovish point of view, that's where you have to move them. On television, there's also a spectrum, you know. There's talk shows, and there's a representative of the left, if you watch television. He's named Michael Kinsley. He kind of represents the left view of things, and he wrote about this too. He took the dovish view, namely that you shouldn't, you know, he was against the Contra war for sure. But he had a very interesting attitude. I mean, around this period, it was revealed, in fact, the Southcom, the American command in Panama that runs this whole show, the chief general testified in Congress, and he said, we're training the Contra forces to attack what are called soft targets, not to duke it out with the Sandinistas, as he put it. So the idea is we're training our terrorist forces to avoid the military in Nicaragua, because they'll get wiped out, and to go after soft targets, that means civilian targets, things like health clinics and agricultural cooperatives and so on. Well, you know, that aroused some questions. The State Department was then asked about that, and they said yes. Their spokesman, Charles Redmond, stated officially, he said, yes, we authorize attacks on agricultural cooperatives and so on. And that's legitimate because the people there carry arms, so therefore they're authentic military targets. Well, America's Watch, which is the leading human rights group, challenged this. They're the only people who challenged it, as far as I know. The press saw nothing wrong with it. They challenged it and said, well, they asked him, do you mean, for example, that it's legitimate for, say, Abu Nidal terrorists to attack an Israeli kibbutz and murder children because people are armed there, as they obviously are? Didn't get an answer. But Michael Kinsley picked it up and wrote an article in which he said, we should not be too quick, he was critical of America's Watch, and he said, we should not be too quick to condemn the resort to terrorist violence. We have to think about it first. We have to ask whether it is cost effective. And the way we determine that is by measuring what he called the amount of blood that is poured in against what comes out at the, whether democracy comes out at the other side, of course, what we call democracy, and we make that decision. So we have to measure, you know, the blood and gore that's poured in by the terrorism against the output, and if it turns out to be cost effective, then we shouldn't really condemn the attacks on soft targets. In fact, we should approve of them. Well, I'm now off at the far liberal end, you know, the people in that position play a very significant role in a free society. They set the limits of debate. It's very important to denounce them as being anti-American, and to call the New York Times the establishment left, and to rage about how the press is under the control of liberals and so on. And in fact, it's not untrue. Like when Limbaugh and these guys say that, they're sort of right. And the reason is that in a well-run propaganda system, that's exactly what you do. If dictators have any brains, that's exactly what they would do. They would let their ideological institutions be run by people who define themselves as critics, and in fact are sometimes kind of soft-hearted and, you know, raise questions about the amount of blood and gore that's poured in and that sort of business, but who basically accept all the underlying premises. They would be the liberal critics. You could then denounce them as being anti-whatever country it is. I might mention in this connection that there's only 2 countries in the world that I know of where the concept of anti-X, X being the name of the country, is taken seriously. One is Stalinist Russia, where anti-Sovietism was absolutely the worst crime. You know, the biggest charge against anybody is anti-Sovietism. The other is the United States, where you have respected books written by, you know, scholars called anti-Americanism, which are respectfully reviewed in the press, and they talk about people who are undermining the American way. In a country that had even a minimal democratic tradition, say Italy, if somebody were to publish a book in Italy on anti-Italianism, people would just laugh, you know. I mean, try to sell that in Milan or Rome and so on. They think it's a joke. Yeah, sure, we're all anti-Italian because we're sane, you know. But in countries with a real totalitarian culture, like say Stalinist Russia or the United States, the notion anti-Americanism or anti-Sovietism is taken very seriously. And in fact, this goes right back to these extraordinary propaganda campaigns about selling the American way and, you know, un-American activities and so on and so forth. And again, it's very striking that this should show up in a free society, and I think entirely natural. Well, what I just mentioned about the Nicaragua case, that goes, I mean, that's standard. In fact, it's hard to find, you know, lots and lots of cases have been looked at. It's hard to find any exception to this. I mean, you sometimes find that the media are not strictly following, say, the positions of corporate America, and it's typically like the one I just described. They're even harsher. Where there's a break between state power and corporate power, the media often tend to move more toward state power. That incidentally goes on right now. So after 10 years of destroying Nicaragua through a terrorist war, actually that's not my judgment. Remember, the United States was condemned by the World Court, the International Court of Justice, for the unlawful use of force in its war against Nicaragua. Actually, the media response to that was quite interesting. Almost 100% of the media, everyone dismissed it, of course, and almost 100% of the media condemned the World Court for discrediting itself by accusing the United States of being the world's leading terrorist after a court hearing, and demanding that the United States offer what would amount to billions of dollars of reparations. The World Court was a hostile forum, as the New York Times put it, so therefore its decision didn't matter, because they're anti-American too, as you can tell by the fact that they didn't like our terrorist activities. After 10 years of course, we totally rejected it, and we forced Nicaragua to abandon its claims. We forced the Nicaraguan government to abandon its claims, to which they were entitled, the claims for reparations, on the threat of even worse if they didn't give it up. And there was actually an agreement made. I don't think it's ever been published, and so far the New York Times won't even allow letters to the editor by international lawyers referring to it. In fact, if you look at the World Court records, there was an agreement that Nicaragua said, okay, they'd abandon the claims because they had made an arrangement that the United States would provide aid instead. That was the condition for abandoning the claims to which they were entitled. Last June or July, I forget, a couple months ago, the Senate voted near unanimously to curtail all aid to Nicaragua until Nicaragua demonstrated that it was not involved in terrorist activities, and allowed the FBI in to investigate to make sure that was true. That's after we have carried out a 10-year terrorist campaign which destroyed the country, which killed maybe 30 or 40,000 people, which left it at the level roughly of Haiti, which was condemned by the World Court. Now we demand that they prove that they're not involved in terrorism, and that sails through the Senate without a vote, and of course without a comment in the press. A couple of days later, a couple of days ago, it got even more grotesque. The Senate passed a vote 94-4, which was, I didn't even see it mentioned in the press, it was on the wires. Maybe it was reported around here, and I don't know who voted which way because they didn't give much information, so there were 4 people who didn't vote with it. It said we will cut off all aid to Nicaragua, that's permanent, until it returns or properly compensates, we judge propriety, not like the World Court, properly compensates for properties confiscated from Americans. What does properties confiscated by Americans mean? That means Somoza properties. That means properties owned by North Americans under the Somoza period, under the period of this monstrous gangster who was torturing the population, and at the end of his rule killed maybe 40, 50,000 people with our support, and was finally driven out. People who had property under that tyranny were people who were participating in that. They had property because they were part of that system of tyranny and robbery. And unless their properties are returned, we're going to cancel the fact that we had an agreement with them that had them, cancel their claims against us at the World Court on condition we provide aid. Of course, nobody even looks at that. Nobody even knows about it, nor will they know about it, because the press isn't going to allow it to be mentioned even in letters. Well, these are levels of kind of imperial arrogance that are extremely hard to achieve in totalitarian society. It's very hard to find counterparts to that. But you can do it when you have deeply instilled totalitarian values. So it doesn't occur to anybody to ask the obvious questions that such matters raise, and there's plenty of them. I could go on with more and more examples. As I say, there's a huge literature on this, but it's extremely systematic. If somebody can find an exception to this, it would be interesting to find. Nobody's found one yet. And the critique of it also doesn't matter, since that doesn't enter public discourse. In fact, you could prove all of this with the certainty of physics, and it wouldn't matter. Because in a properly controlled ideological system, the wrong thoughts are never spoken. Okay, so you just keep them out. And in corporate media, which are linked to state and corporate power, that's not very hard. They're kept out of the academic institutions too, except for the most marginal exceptions. So people, it's a free country, so people are allowed to go around the country talking about these things, and some small publisher somewhere can publish a book, which if you can ever hear about it, you can buy, and there's a couple of journals around. So maybe, you know, like 1% of the population or something knows something about these things. And since it's a free society, you don't do anything to them, like you don't stick them in jail and that sort of business. But it's very important that the responsible men, you know, the people in the mainstream, they've got to be deeply indoctrinated. Now, I should finally add, last comment on this stuff, it's not in the least clear that this propaganda works for the general population. In fact, there's pretty strong evidence that it doesn't. So it certainly works very well among the educated classes. I mean, there it's just overwhelming. But if you look at the general population, it doesn't seem to work well at all. In fact, on issue after issue, the general population, we're a heavily polled society. There's a very good reason for that. Polls are mostly run by business. They want to keep their finger on the public pulse. You know, if you're running huge propaganda campaigns to control the public mind, you've got to know what people think. So the extensive polling, which, you know, occasionally makes it to the newspapers, but mostly it goes to the business community. And we know a lot about public attitudes on all sorts of things. And pretty dramatically, they're off the political spectrum on almost every issue. So you take, say, healthcare, which I mentioned before. There have been polls on health ever since the mid-40s. And while the establishment, you know, like the press, say, is like 100% against allowing the United States to join the modern world and to have the kind of health system everybody else has, the public has always been for it. Either majorities or considerable pluralities, you know, depending on the questions are asked, have been in favor of some version of national health care. The term that's used for that in the United States now is a Canadian-style system. The reason for the term is that people know that Canada exists. You know, it's close enough so that you sort of see it right there. But in fact, the Canadian-style system is just a system everybody has, you know, except for us. And in fact, Canada has one of the least efficient of them. But most of the considerable majority, and that remains the case. Like if you read there's a huge media campaign now going on to try to ram through Clinton's new version of this insurance company-based, highly bureaucratic, very inefficient system. And the media are, again, about 100% in favor of it. But if you read the big articles, like, you know, these front page articles in the New York Times and so on, if you get down to, you know, second page, you know, the continuation page at the bottom of the column, there'll be a comment that says 59% of the population are in favor of a Canadian-style system, but that's not in the cards. It's not in the cards because it's called politically impossible. Politically impossible means big corporations aren't in favor of it, and the wealthy aren't in favor of it, so it's politically impossible. It doesn't matter if 99% of the population want it. The fact that 59% want it, or, you know, whatever the number is, depending on how you ask the question, is a pretty remarkable fact, because they never heard that anybody is in favor of it. You know, each person who says I'm in favor of it thinks I'm the only person in the world who's in favor of it, because they've never seen it anywhere else. You know, so those numbers are, you know, extremely unusual. I mean, if the issues were ever allowed to appear, it wouldn't be 59% or whatever the number is. It would be overwhelming, and that's been true since the 1940s. There are studies of polls since the 1940s that are quite consistently like that, and it just doesn't matter as long as the public remain spectators and not participants. It doesn't matter. And if you look at other issues, it's quite the same. So let's say take the Vietnam War. Among educated people, the spectrum is extremely narrow. The Vietnam War is considered, if you're a liberal, it was a mistake. I'm quoting now from the extreme liberals, our blundering efforts to do good turned into a disaster. That's Anthony Lewis, the New York Times. Or it was an excess of disinterested benevolence and righteousness, the leading academic critic of the work, John King Fairbank and so on. That's the kind of liberal extreme, and then you go over from there. But it was a noble cause in which we defended South Vietnam, and maybe we made a mistake, and maybe it was too costly to us, so we should have gotten out or not gotten in. That's the general educated attitude. On the other hand, if you look at the population, it's astonishing. Although they've never heard anything like this. Up until the most recent polls, you know, running from 1970 up till the present, about 70% of the population, plus or minus a few percentages, have held to the position that the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Well, that's not, that's a radical difference between the general population and the educated population. It has a name. It's called the Vietnam syndrome. It's kind of disease that one of the Reaganite intellectuals called it sickly inhibitions against the use of military force. Phrase right out of the Nazi. It's Norman Podhoretz. But they can't eradicate the disease from the general population, although there's been enormous efforts to do it. And if you go through issue after issue, you find something kind of similar, which is sort of striking, and raises some questions about whether the propaganda campaign is actually working among the public. But it's working in one important sense. It's got the public marginalized. They're in the spectator role. They're isolated, atomized, they may not like things and so on, but they have the feeling they can't do anything about it. Power somewhere else, which is not wrong, but of course doesn't have to be true. It's not a law of nature. There have been attempts throughout our history to keep the bewildered herd bewildered and not meddling in stuff that's not their affairs. Repeatedly, the public has broken through and done something about that, and it can certainly do it again. But the beginnings of wisdom on this are to understand at least the way the indoctrination system works. Okay. We have time for you guys, for the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, to meddle if you feel so inclined, so please be as meddlesome as you like. Are there some microphones? Or no microphones down there? Okay.
I'm delighted to say that here, that since the last time I heard you speak at MIT 20 years ago, when we were still in the heat of escaping or badgering ourselves about the Vietnam peace talks. And I know you know a lot about it and have written a lot about it. As a child of that period, in the sense of political awareness of what I thought it was, and I don't want to over-personalize this, but it's a historical frame of reference. And maybe if the average age here is 23 or 24 or younger, including the faculty, a frame of reference on Nicaragua or might be valid. It does seem to me that you yourself have become almost cynical rather than enlightened and skeptical as you were then. In the sense that while there clearly were efforts to control public opinion, both from the corporate, business, military, industrial complex, whatever labels we wish to use, were very real things, during the civil rights, Vietnam, women's movement, and then environmental movements of the 60s and 70s. Just for the purpose of lively argument, I would contend that this gradually, the people, some millions, some few millions of them, whether college students, workers out of work, mothers of dead soldiers, were not at all to be seen just as bewildered spectators, although it might have been nice for the power people if they stayed there. They got angry enough, they gave each other courage. We did some stuff, not that we won anything, but there was certainly a reshuffling of this, now what they're calling totalitarian context. And I guess it's the term totalitarian that bothers me. I think what is valid is a kind of corporate collective or collective corporatism which would like to control in the way you have said.
But don't succeed.
I don't think we really have. No, I think there's a lot of participants that file suit on toxic waste and housewives from both canals.
I agree.
These aren't bewildered people. They're pissed off.
I agree with you completely. I had mentioned, and maybe I should have said it more, but I mentioned that there have been two recent periods three recent periods actually, of massive propaganda efforts to try to drive the population back into passivity. The first was Woodrow Wilson's. The second was around late 30s through, right after the Second World War, both of which succeeded. First one was broken by the Depression. The second was broken by what we call the 60s, and as I said, the third one hasn't succeeded. In fact, if you look, I think what you said is exactly correct. I mean, what I mentioned about the, Vietnam syndrome